This is the first of a selection of readings from my collection of anecdotes entitled The Exploded Illustrator. From the age of 17, I was trained as a technical illustrator for the Admiralty. That was many years ago. Some illustrations can depict an item as if exploded, so that its parts can be focused on individually to reveal its function. Here in focus will be some of my memories of the wartime home front, its aftermath, crazy adventures, and tales of my family, pets, and homes. Take heed, my hazardous episodes should be viewed as cautionary tales and not copied. Focus 1. In my beginning, there was the word. Walrus. What did he say? My sisters were amazed. From my sunny pram, my first real word. Well, of course, I'd uttered the usual mum, mum, dada, goo, goo that all babes do. But this seminal expression was the real first. I even remember it, I think. It's all mixed up with hazy ghost images of my own dawn. I had been a replacement for a dearly loved child lost in the most tragic circumstances. Gordon was only 8 when a pot of boiling water was upset upon him. Aunt Molly was not to blame, although she went from the family and wasted away. It was that small home, so cramped with so many souls, the kids huddled around the range, the boiling water, and poor Molly reaching across. The sudden slip, and it was all over. For a few days, Gordon lingered in the Frank James Hospital just along the road, but he was too badly hurt to survive. There are 2 blocks of dwellings on the north side of Alfred Street, these being mirror images of those on the south side of the roadway which slopes down towards the river. Narrow passages alongside and a pathway at the back provide access to tiny backyards and back doors. From each yard, one has to cross the rear pathway and step up a little to enter each individual strip of garden. It was in the garden of number 26 on fine summer afternoons that my pram was placed. There my tunnel view was of the milky blue passing sky, fringed by breeze-kissed lace. Occasionally the loving faces of my sisters filled the frame. I heard the distant racket of shipyards and the aircraft factory where my father worked. Saunders Row at the time was producing amphibious walrus aircraft. The newly built aeroplanes were slipped from the factory into Cowes Harbour, from where they were flown a short distance to Northwood Aerodrome near West Cowes. Like drifting box kites, they spluttered across my window, fleeting shadows. I must have heard their name from one of my cradle-rocking doters. Quite natural that I should join in. Mebs and Stan were my mum and dad. The rest of us were my brother and sisters, Marjorie, Cecil, Maureen, Barbara, and me. That was 1940. All I remember of the home itself is the scattered, broken slates, the gaping windows with torn curtain fronds hanging, the smell of brick dust and soot, and smashed roofs open to the elements. In the early morning of April the 28th, 1942, there was a hit-and-run raid by German fighter bombers on Cowes. Although several people were killed, this was only a precursor of what was to come. On the night of May the 4th-5th, these towns became the next victim of the Luftwaffe's by-Decker list. 2 raids in one night. Shortly before 11 p.m., flares ignited over the town. The first attack from an estimated 50 aircraft lasted an hour, some 20 of the raiders returning after rearming to pound the towns again just after 3:30 a.m. It is believed that East and West Cowes attracted more than 200 tons of bombs, classifying it in Luftwaffe eyes as a major attack. The German bombers were mainly targeting the Saunders Row aircraft factories and the yards and workshops of John Samuel White's, the Cowes shipbuilder. J.S. White's had built the destroyer Łyskawica for the Polish Navy before the war, and at the time of the raid she was back in port undergoing a refit. She had a close shave in the attack of April the 28th, but this time took a hit on her superstructure. Nevertheless, she gave a tremendous account of herself on Monday night. Her guns, keeping up a constant barrage, became red hot and were doused with seawater. Although the first raid started around 11 p.m, the preceding hours had been uncannily still. As my brother Cecil recalls, there had been an ominous atmosphere. The distant howling of dogs added to a grave foreboding. Since the early morning attack of the previous week, my father had sensed there would be some sort of follow-up. He had made us all sleep downstairs on mattresses so as to be ready to leave quickly. The authorities had built 2 brick air raid shelters in our garden. These were sited so that the doors faced one another with a narrow space in between. As soon as the siren went, Dad took one look outside and immediately ordered everyone to get into the air raid shelter. Outside, flares which looked like flaming strings of onions were hanging in the sky. It was then that Maureen knew that there was definitely something up, but she was worried about a little kitten she had recently taken in. This was no time to dawdle. Dad frog-marched her along the path, and as they entered the shelter, an incendiary bomb scuttled into the doorway. Quick action was called for, and Dad grabbed the spluttering device by its small fins and tossed it away. This deed was to bring him the thanks and admiration of those in the shelter, but a severe telling off from a neighbour the next day. The incendiary had singed Dad's fingers, but it had also destroyed our neighbour's fence. When the air raid subsided, Dad left our shelter to get us some lemonade. The pub was at the bottom of Alfred Street, called the Castle, and they had a particularly nice brand which all the kids liked. Opposite the pub, Billy Love's sweet shop was ablaze. Billy was a man who eked out a meagre ration of sweets with a determined will. There was never any chocolate available. That night the gutter was running with the stuff. At the pub, the landlord was about to leave. Dad asked if he could have some pop. The landlord replied that if he cared to go in and help himself, he was quite welcome, but to mind the big hole in the floor because there was an unexploded bomb in the cellar. I don't think we got our drinks. Soon the bombers were overhead once more. This time the enemy needed no flares, as the burning towns and docks pinpointed the target. Bombs began falling in sticks of 4. There were planes roaring over every minute. We heard the bombs scream down, flashes and explosions. The blasts were terrific. That was Maureen. After the raids, we were not allowed inside our home, as the buildings were dangerous. However, we did manage to salvage a few possessions, and it was on this occasion that the devastation was impressed on the memory of a 3-year-old. My memory. From amongst the slates and rubble, I can remember collecting a small wicker basket and a broken stool which my father had made for me. It was a gift of many he had created for his children, and this one was definitely mine, because Dad had chiselled my name on its seat, John. More about this later, and also about the effect of the raids on other residents. We set out from Mark's Corner on the edge of Parkhurst Forest, where my Aunt Edith lived with her husband Bert Bye in Jubilee Cottage, formerly a dairy. There was no public service running, as a lot of roads were blocked or had UXBs, that's unexploded bombs. On foot with few possessions, we crossed the Medina River by the chain ferry, and then tried the most direct route towards Thorness, trudging up Newport Road. Very soon we returned back, as a huge bomb had exploded in the cemetery. It was deemed unsafe and, due to the scattered remains of so many bodies in various stages of decomposition, unhealthy for anyone to get near. Eventually, having picked our way through the rubble-strewn streets of Cowes all the way to Gurnard, a kind taxi driver took pity on us and drove our little band of refugees all the way to our destination, refusing any fee. Not only had we lost our home and most of our possessions, there was one other great tragedy. At the outbreak of war, Dad had secured a place for his beloved boat within the boathouse of a local yacht club. It was laid up on a rack between other special small vessels. When the first air raid started, an incendiary plunged through the boathouse roof, smack into the middle of Ginevra. She was totally burnt out, but boats on either side were unscathed. All that remained was a berth cushion which had been stowed elsewhere. We were at Mark's Corner for 6 weeks, then went to 55 Argyle Street, Ryde, which was to become my happy home for 23 years. A little note, after we'd been there for a few years, number 55 was renumbered as 65. My sister Maureen had been worried about her friend Molly Lee, and it wasn't until we were at Ryde for some time that the girls saw each other at the same moment in the high street. They rushed to one another and just hugged. Molly, an East Cowes girl, was that day only visiting Ryde. That was 1942. Apparently, at 3, I was regarded as a bit of a tough guy. It was probably due to my fondness for the Richmal Crompton Just William books. Almost as soon as we moved into our new home at Ryde, a neighbour who had noted my real boy demeanour asked Mum if I could be allowed to play with her son, who she worried was a little too interested in dolls and other girly things. I was to be a swarthy influence on Robin. The experiment went well, but had to be terminated when we were discovered kissing. Of the preceding anecdote, I remember nothing. I've only been told by my sisters, and it's been the source of much shared amusement through the years. Just giving it a little further thought, however, perhaps my liking for the Just William books came later, resulting from well-intentioned guidance from my family, who sought to adjust my behaviour. I always had a Just William book amongst my Christmas and birthday presents. Oh well, so much for philosophy. Dad could turn his hand to anything, and did. On leaving school at around 14, he'd been taken around one of the local factories to choose his trade. It was to be working with metal, and all because he was so impressed by the grimiest workers. Real men in a young boy's eyes. In later life, yet before me, his passion, as already mentioned, was his cabin cruiser, which he had built from some old hull he'd saved any spare money to acquire. Then, in my early teens, I recall him building clinker boats from scratch in our downstairs front room at Ryde. I was employed as holder, with a lump of metal against the copper nails as he clenched them over rows within the hole. By this time he had forgiven me, forgiven my dreadful childhood crime. I was about 8. For a few years, Dad in excursions to a nearby copse had been watching a particular sapling grow into the right size for one of its branch divisions to yield a perfectly angled breasthook. That's the V-shaped member which joins the gunwales at the prow, for a boat he was planning to build. The prime cut was eventually harvested by Dad one dark night. He took it home and carefully seasoned it in the cupboard beneath our stairs. A long process. Being a good boy, I had decided to chop up some firewood. It was the closest my father came to committing murder. Ginevra, Dad's cabin cruiser, was named after the schooner in which my great-grandfather Charles Blake was crew member way back in the 1800s. The ship's name was also used for the Blakes' home on the shore of Steeple Cove near Ventnor, Isle of Wight, in which my mother, Mabel Dorothy Palale Howard, was brought up by her grandparents, Sarah and Charles Blake. One of 11 and a half offspring, she, with sister Edith and brother Stanley, were moved out of the Howards' home at Wroxall as there was just too little room for them all. My Aunt Tot was the half. She was a baby found on the doorstep, taken in and raised as one of the family. It's worth mentioning that my great-grandfather clocked up some interesting moments during his long life. As a boy, he'd run away to sea. A mistake. He only joined the ship Ginevra after being released from Dorchester Prison, where he'd been on the treadmill for deserting from the Royal Navy. He later redeemed his honour, however, by becoming the Empress Elizabeth of Austria's favourite bathing attendant whilst she holidayed at Ventnor. One wonders what that position involved. Even after the lady had a nasty riding accident in Fécamp, France, she sent for him to attend her needs. His wife Sarah wouldn't let him go. Mabel's father, George, Joe Howard, at the end of his life also lived at Ginevra, but not within the cottage. He had a small chalet and shed at the seaward end of the garden, and his time was down to fishing, making crab and lobster pots, and being a seaside character to summer visitors. Joe had his moment of fame when the national press reported his rescue of a great seabird. It was reported to be an albatross by an eminent ornithologist. Photos of the bird, looking suspiciously like a gannet, were published, and in recent years I was shown a photo postcard that Joe had commissioned. This card was discovered in a curiosity shop in Eastbourne, complete with a "Wish You Were Here" note to the effect that Mr. Howard, owner of the albatross, had given it to the sender. Attached to the postcard by means of a rusty pin was a press cutting reporting the death of the albatross. Apparently the publicity had been ongoing, somewhat encouraged by Joe. It's due to my mother's great pride in often telling me about Granddad's strange pet that I wrote my short story, Joseph's Magic Albatross. When Mabel left school, she got a job in a local bakery. Then as now, the boys chased the girls, and Mabel was not excluded. One such chase ended in a sticky situation. She fell from a narrow stairway to finish up to her waist in a barrel of treacle. She never liked the smell of syrup from that day on. So this, at page 18, is the end of Focus 1. Here on my iPad, I am flipping through some of the 340 pages that comprise the 28 focused chapters in my manuscript. The work has many illustrations and links to my John's Flicks short movies that are relevant to the narrative. This updated edition is now available as a free PDF file. Please see the link in the descriptions of this movie. In future, I intend producing further short extracts of selected anecdotes from various focus chapters. Please subscribe and watch out for my offerings. However, bear in mind that I am now at the overripe, wrinkled age of 82 and slowing down a little. To mention just a few subjects: supper at the yacht club. The meal is placed before me. A tap on my shoulder. I'm informed that my home is on fire. I am presented to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. I also meet Captain Mannering of Dad's army. I walk naked into a room full of people. There are many other adventures. Some are dangerously foolish. So, for the time being, thanks for watching.